of welcoming you and our special guest to tonight's lecture, with which we will close this season. I would like to extend a special welcome to the American Consul, Mr. Shearburn. He is a regular member of our audience. Since the demand for the lecture was so great, we looked for a larger room. Due to this change of location, a late start was inevitable. I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. 2 weeks ago, when we hosted an evening with Peter Matthiessen, I announced that the John Adams Institute found a solution to its financial dilemma. Since the majority of you were not there that evening, I'd like to share the good news with you too. In continuing the lecture series, American Literature Today and American Focus, we found a sponsor, or perhaps I should say, a sponsor found us. So we will be able to continue our work next year and the year after that. Thank you, it's great. Our speaker this evening is Professor Deborah Tannen. Ms. Tannen, it's an honor to welcome you here tonight. Your engagement is a highlight of the American Focus series. Ms. Tannen will be introduced by Yvonne Kronenberg, psychologist, author, and columnist. Her novels deal mainly with love and relationships. Yvonne Kronenberg will give a short introduction, after which she will hand the floor to Deborah Tannen. There will be no intermission. After Ms. Tannen's lecture, we will continue the program with the question and answer session, and please use the microphones. We will end the evening at 9:45 at the latest, to give you a chance to buy books or have them signed, and book signing will take place here at the podium. I would like to thank the Renaissance Hotel and the Koepelzaal for their hospitality, the Dutch publisher Prometheus for their cooperation and participation in tonight's program, and last but not least, our volunteers. We couldn't run this series without them. Yvonne Kronenberg, I hand the floor to you. I have this problem. I still have this problem. Okay, you'll hear me speak English tonight. I don't really know why. My first lover was not a great talker. In fact, he didn't speak at all. He'd been that way since childhood. His mother told me that from the age of 14, he didn't utter one word for 3 years. To me, he didn't say much either. When I asked him a question that he considered irrelevant, he would just stare at me in silence. I never dared to ask him anything without thoroughly examining my mind as to the importance of the question and the necessity of an answer. Rather than asking him what time it was, I would call inquiries. To fill the gaps between sex and sex, I would tell stories I thought would interest him. I would formulate opinions, and I would despair. How could we possibly live long and happily ever after if I was to be the one who would have to do all the talking? Why don't you say something, I wailed. Tell me anything at all. Like what? When the eternity I hoped our love would last turned out a lot shorter than we expected, I found a new love. This was an interesting man. He read books. I only have to ask him about a book he has read, and we can talk for hours, I thought. I was wrong. When I asked about his reading, he would just hand me the book and tell me to see for myself what it was all about. One summer we went cycling together in England. For 3 weeks we struggled through the British hills in utter silence. Let's talk, I begged. About what? The next man I loved, I met on a party where he was the center of attention.
He would tell funny stories, talk about newly released films, about travel, politics, about the world. I fell head over heels in love with him. Here was a man who would be a fountain of conversation. He was. He would talk all day. He was like a bloody radio station. He never shut up. But somehow, I still felt something was lacking. We didn't actually talk. We didn't talk to each other. He would say something to which I might say something in return, but we never made contact, in my opinion. Darling, there's something I should like to talk about, I said one day. About what? About us. About what? Men and women have a different way of talking. Women want to talk about what goes on between people. Men want to talk about things. They know about things. They can see them, hear them, and in some cases repair them. That makes things easy and comfortable to talk about. What goes on between people has a lot to do about what goes on inside their heads. Men, most men that is, do not like to talk about what goes on inside a head, especially not about what goes on inside a woman's head. What goes on inside a woman's head very often turns out to be something he is found lacking in. Feelings, for instance. Men are generally not too fond of talking about feelings. The main reason is they don't know how. A neurobiologist told me why. The brain is divided into a left and a right hemisphere. Emotions center in the right one, language resides in the left. In a woman's brain, the left and the right hemisphere are connected by countless nerve paths. In a man's brain, there's only a few, just enough to allow a man to say, "But I love you," when he just made you cry. He isn't cruel or cold. He may have wonderful emotions flowing through his right hemisphere, but he cannot talk about them. And in some hardened cases, he doesn't even know they're there at all. Most men do not think in terms of feelings, of relationships, of bonds and interhuman contact. When you ask a man what he's thinking of, he says, "Nothing." Or, "Of buying a convertible." Now, women don't believe a man cannot do better than that. They remember how tender and attentive he was when he first declared his love. "When did you first realize you were in love with me?" she asks. "Oh, when I saw you at the bicycle shop," he says. "You were wearing a light blue t-shirt." "Oh, my hair was a mess." "You were gorgeous." "At first I thought it was my girlfriend you were after." "That fish? Hell no, I would never fancy a girl like that. She doesn't have your..." "Yes, my what?" That conversation took place a long time ago, and it won't come back. Since that light blue t-shirt, he's never again noticed what she was wearing, and he hasn't talked about it intimately with her either. My brother once told me he got into a fight with his girlfriend because she wanted to sit on the sofa and talk the way they used to do. "Why must we sit on a sofa and pretend we don't know each other?" he asked. "I've known you for ages. We've been together for over a year." My brother's not alone. His girlfriend is not the only one. All over the world, men and women criticize each other for the way they talk, the way they think. Today, John Adams Institute has invited Dr. Deborah Tannen, who is an expert in this field. She's a linguist, a professor at Georgetown University. She studied in Berkeley, California, received an overwhelming number of grants, fellowships, invitations to lecture. She's written 15 books on the subject of human communication. Her bestsellers have been translated into at least 13 languages. In the Netherlands, she's especially famous for the following titles: "That's Not What I Meant," "You Just Don't Understand," and "Talking from 9 to 5. The first of these books is about the invisible processes that are at work when people talk to each other. Some people talk, for instance, softly, some raise their voices. Now, how do these things affect our communications? What frames are operational when we speak to each other? Why don't we just say what we mean and stop beating about those countless bushes? In "You Just Don't Understand," Deborah Tannen focuses on the specific problems that exist between men and women. Why can't women talk more like men, and vice versa? In Talking from 9 to 5, Professor Tannen writes about communication in a professional setting. Why do women bump their heads against the glass ceiling? Why are their words so often ignored, their qualities undervaluated? Now, nobody can explain these things better than the author herself. I have the honor of shutting up so that the real expert can speak. Deborah Tannen, please.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I think truly that is the most unique and most wonderful introduction I ever had. In fact, I was wishing I could sit back and listen to Yvonne read for the next 45 minutes.
No, you
rather
guys.
than having to tell my own stories, which I've heard before. But it is a great pleasure to address you here in Amsterdam, a city that I love very much, that I first came to many, many, many years ago when I was 15. And you know how impressionable you are at the age of 15, and the city seems so magical, and it still seems that way to me. So this is really a great pleasure. I had thought that I would begin tonight by telling you something about how I got into this field and how my various books are related to each other, but because of the introduction that Yvonne gave, I think I have to move right into a particular example that for me was something crystallized when I had this experience, because it relates somewhat to the what she just read, and then I'll back up and give you the other introduction. I once was invited to address a group in a living room, an informal group. It was a women's group, but for the evening that I was there, they also invited men. And I was talking about differences between how women and men use language, and more general about different conversational styles. And I made the point that very often women, if they live with men, one complaint that they frequently make is, "He doesn't talk to me." And there was a couple sitting on the couch, and I noticed this couple because the entire evening the woman never said anything. They were sitting together holding hands, but she never said anything at all. She was completely silent. And the man sitting next to her was the most vocal person in the group. Whenever there was a question, he was the first with the answer. He asked me questions. He was extremely talkative. Well, when I made this observation that women often complain about the men they live with, "He doesn't talk to me," this man spoke up and he pointed to the woman next to me and said, "That's absolutely right. She's the talker in our family." And everyone laughed, as you did, and the poor fellow looked very surprised and hurt, because no one wants to be laughed at. He said, "But it's true. At the end of the day, I come home, and I have nothing to say, but she talks all evening. And if she didn't, we would spend the evening in silence." And this seemed to me to answer the puzzle that I frequently was asked: who really talks more, women or men? There is a stereotype in our culture, I probably hear too, that women talk too much. In fact, there's a joke that my father likes very much to tell. An older couple goes to the judge and they ask for a divorce. And the judge turns to the wife and he says, "Why do you want a divorce?" And she says, "Well, my husband hasn't spoken to me in 2 years." And so the judge turns to the husband and says, "Why haven't you spoken to your wife in 2 years?" And he says, "Well, I didn't want to interrupt her." So, which is the truth? Here is the stereotype supported by the joke that women talk all the time and men don't want to interrupt them. And then we have the complaint, "My husband doesn't talk to me," and the reality that I observed that evening, that the man was doing all the talking, the woman never spoke, and then he says, "She's the talker in our family." And the difference seemed to be captured by the difference between public speaking and private speaking. The difference in how women and men are inclined to interpret that situation at the end of the day when you come home and you've been working. Perhaps you've both been working and you both come home, or perhaps one has been working and the other has been at home. But it's the end of the day, you come together, And there seems to be a very different way of interpreting that situation. And I'm going to be saying throughout the evening things about women and men, but I always want to keep in mind that nothing is true for all women and men. These generalizations do not hold for everybody. We're only talking about tendencies and percentages. But there seems to be a tendency for men to feel, I've been out there in the world all day using language to make sure that nobody takes advantage of me, to make sure that I can show what I know, get the respect that I should get. And this is a strain. And now that I'm home, I have nothing to prove. I should be free not to talk. Whereas she feels, I've been out all day, and I have had to be very careful of how I use language. If I talk too much, people will think I'm aggressive. If I say the wrong thing, I might offend somebody. And so now I'm home, I'm free to talk. Very different assumption about the role of talk in a relationship. And you can trace these differences, I trace the differences in part, back to the way boys and girls learn to use language as children growing up. Sometimes I say to people, sometimes have you ever experienced the feeling that when you talk to somebody of the other sex, you feel like you're talking to somebody from another world? People have this feeling. And the reason is that you are. Boys and girls really do, in a sense, grow up in different worlds, in the sense that they tend to play with other children of the same sex. And this seems to be true in every country of the world that people have observed. If children are given their own choice, they will choose to play with other children of the same sex. Sometimes they're not given a choice. The teacher may force them to play together, or brothers and sisters may play together, or neighbors may play together. But if there is a choice, children will choose to play with other children of the same sex. And they seem to play quite differently. So the typical situation for girls is that a little girl has a best friend, and that best friend is the center of her social life. So they spend a lot of time sitting and talking, and much of what they talk about is telling each other secrets. So your best friend is the one you tell your secrets to. Being close means you tell each other everything. So with this as the basis, you can understand why an adult, if you're heterosexual, you have a close relationship with a man, you feel he's going to be a new and improved version of a best friend. We will tell each other everything. And perhaps in the beginning it seems like you do, but slowly over time, she may become more and more talkative the more she feels comfortable with him, and he may become more and more silent the more he feels we have nothing to prove. Because if you look at the way he learned to use language as a child, it's quite different. Little boys tend to play in larger groups, and it's the activity that makes them friends. And I have read this in the studies of other people, and I have also interviewed little children myself. And if I ask little boys, who's your best friend? They might say, I have several best friends, and my best friends are the ones I do things with. It's the activities, it's doing things together that makes them close. So when you're grown up and you're living with a woman and you're together and you're doing things together, you feel satisfied. This is proof that we're close. You don't feel something is missing because you're not talking and telling each other everything. The boys do use language, but they tend to use language for a very different purpose. The boys' groups are more obviously hierarchical. In other words, the group is larger, and other boys are allowed in, but not every boy is treated the same. So some boys have higher status than other boys, and the higher status boys will give orders and push the lower status boys around. So language, talking, thank you, talking is one of the ways that you can negotiate your status in that group. Now this is a slanted thing, and I can put it underneath. And okay, otherwise it slides right down. So for the boys' groups, talk is not so much the way they negotiate how close they are, but the way they negotiate who has higher status in the group. So, and if you think about what girls are doing when they're together telling secrets, it's easy to understand why you can't let all the girls on the block come and join you, because you're doing something quite private. But if you're playing a game, a ball game, you can let other people come. But once in the group, they have to negotiate what their relative status will be in that group. Also, the girls' groups put a lot of emphasis on appearing the same. So if one girl talks in a way that implies she knows more or she's better, the other girls are critical of her. And they say, boy, she really thinks she's something, and they don't want to play with her. She's stuck up. And girls who tell the others what to do in a very obvious way, girls will say she's bossy, and they don't want to play with her. You don't find boys accusing each other of being bossy. Rather, the boy who is the leader, the boy who is high status, is the leader. So the girl who tells other girls what to do is bossy. The boy who tells other boys what to do is the leader, if he's able to be successful at it and make it stick. So they grow up with very different attitudes toward the role of language. And I want to make another thing very explicit here that I will try to remind us of as I speak. It's very easy to feel that there are value judgments associated with these ways of using language, especially to say, well, to use language to create intimacy and closeness is good. To use language to negotiate status is bad. I don't feel this is the case. I don't feel that one is good and one is bad. All of us in our relationships have to negotiate. Are we close or distant? How close are we? And is somebody of higher status than the other? Westerners, both Europeans as well as Americans, often feel that hierarchy is somehow bad. But if you think of the Asian cultures, Japanese, Chinese, it's a very good corrective to this, where the idea of hierarchy doesn't have a negative connotation. Quite the opposite. One of my graduate students who's Japanese did a study of Japanese and American discussion groups, and she commented that for the Japanese groups, that in contrast with the Americans who functioned like individuals working on a task together, she said the Japanese group members were united in a hierarchy. And this took me by surprise. I thought, united by hierarchy. In my idea, hierarchy is something that separates you. If someone is dominant and someone is subordinate, you can't be close. But in reading about this and talking about it to other Asians, it becomes clear that in these cultures, the typical hierarchical relationship is mother-child or grandparent-grandchild. And so it's very hierarchical, but it's also very close. And there's an assumption that I think Westerners often feel that all of the obligations go to the subordinate and all the privileges go to the dominant person. In many other cultures of the world, including Asian and including Indonesian culture, there's a feeling that both the subordinate and the dominant person have both obligations and privileges. So it's not this assumption that hierarchy is such a bad thing. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Also, that we are all balancing our need for relative hierarchy and relative closeness. So I try to get back to that as I go. Now I can back up and say, how did I get into all this, and how does my interest in gender fit into the work I've been doing my whole career? And what some people may be wondering, how are these different books different from each other? The new one, Talking from 9 to 5, where the Dutch title is Words at Work. The previous one, You Just Don't Understand, also about women and men, as well as the first one, That's Not What I Meant. I feel often surprised to realize that I think I will go down in history as the gender lady. People think of me mostly as an expert on gender, but I think of myself mostly as an expert on language, how people use language in everyday life, and how language is has an effect and is a force in relationships. The first book, That's Not What I Meant, introduces this idea about what I call conversational style, that people have very different conversational styles, different ways of saying what we mean. So we think we just say what we mean, and we think other people should say what they mean. People often ask me, why don't people say what they mean? But I never had anyone say to me, I don't say what I mean. We all think that we say what we mean, and it's other people who don't. Because other people say things and they don't say it the way we would say it if we meant the same thing in the same way. Because they have different conversational styles. And the conversational style results from many things. Whether you are female or male is certainly one important influence because of the socialization. But ethnic background, regional background, class background, sexual orientation, the kind of business that you're in, individual personality, many things influence a person's conversational style. And in the first book, and that's not what I meant, I tried to give this general idea about different conversational styles and lead to the conclusion that you cannot assume that other people mean what you mean if you say the same thing in the same way. Because conversational style is invisible, you tend to blame the other person when there's a difference. You think, my way is right, your way is wrong, so if there's a difference, you must be doing something wrong. I want to give you an example first that does not come from gender to capture this idea that conversational style differs by many other things other than gender. If two people speak who have a slightly different sense of pacing and pausing, how much pause should you leave between one person's conversation and another person's talk? Because we all feel in conversation, you speak, then I speak, then you speak. But how do I know when you're finished and it's my turn to speak? We judge by many things, including the intonation pattern and what the person has said, if you think that they've come to the main point. But we also judge by pause. Have they left the right amount of pause that says, I'm finished, I have no more to say, now it's your turn to speak? But people have very different sense of how much pause is appropriate between one turn and the next. If two people speak, and one person is expecting, let's say, this much pause, and the other person is expecting this much pause, what happens is that this much pause comes first. So while this person is waiting for this much pause, the other person begins to get uncomfortable. There's an uncomfortable silence coming up. I guess the other person has nothing to say. I'd better come in and take the floor and save the day so that we don't sit here in an uncomfortable silence. And if this happens again and again and again over time, you start blaming each other. So the person who expects the longer pause says, you're only interested in hearing yourself talk. You're not interested in what I have to say. You're always interrupting me. And the person expecting the shorter pause says, you never tell me anything. You sit there like a bump on a log. Don't you have anything to say? And when you accuse each other, the accusation seems terribly unfair. And if it happens with a person you live with, then it can seem extremely painful because this person should understand you, if anyone does. One time I remember I was on a call-in radio show talking about these issues, and a woman called in, but I could hear her husband in the background. And she was saying that every evening, in the evening, if they have guests over for dinner, she tries her best to be a good host and make everybody comfortable and keep the conversation going. And then after the guests leave, her husband turns to her and says, you did it again. You were interrupting everybody all the time. You never give the guests a chance to speak. You don't give me a chance to speak. And she felt so unjustly accused because she was putting out all this effort to make the conversation lively. And she said, why do you say that I'm accusing you of not speaking? You're a big boy. You can get into the conversation the same way I do. And he said, you need a crowbar to get into those conversations. You know what a crowbar is? It was the mutual blame that to me was so unfortunate and understandable, that he was accusing her of not being a good person because he's interrupting. And she was accusing him of not being a grown-up. You're a big boy. You can get into the conversation. People who expect the shorter pause don't realize that people waiting for a longer pause cannot get into the conversation. These things are very automatic. You learn over time. This is the rhythm that conversation needs. And you don't have the same capability to get into a fast-paced conversation. Perhaps some of you have experienced this speaking with Americans, if you're not American. Or if you are American, perhaps you have experienced this speaking to Dutch speakers. That the Americans may expect a shorter pause, and so they seem always to be interrupting everybody and accusing others of having nothing to say. Another point that I want to make to illustrate here with interruption, that these are not absolute values, and nothing about conversational style is an absolute value, a long pause or a short pause. It's always relative to the person that you're speaking to. And I became aware of this in the following way. I have a colleague. Now, perhaps you have already noticed that I tend to speak rather quickly. And this is because I grew up in New York City. New Yorkers have a reputation for speaking rather quickly. I had a colleague who was from the Midwest of the United States, where people speak more slowly. And I discovered when I spoke to him that when I thought he had nothing more to say, I had to wait and count to 7. And sometimes, amazingly, 1, 2, 3, 4, he would begin to speak. And this improved our relationship quite a bit, because suddenly he had many more things to say, and I found he was very interesting. And I think he liked me better because I gave him a chance to speak. This colleague was married to a woman who was Chinese from Hawaii. And when she spoke to him, he was the fast talker and she was the slow talker. So she always accused him. You ask me a question and then you answer and you speak again before I can answer. You don't give me a chance to think. And he accused her. You never tell me what's on your mind. You're always so quiet. So between my friend Ron and his wife Susie, he was the fast talker and she was the slow talker. Well, they did research among Athabascan Indians in Alaska. And among Athabascan Indians, it's very common to have very long pauses. In fact, I'm told it's not unusual. If you ask someone a question, they may give you the answer the next day. And that's fine. That's acceptable. And in fact, Athabascans will tell you that when you meet someone you don't know, you don't talk to them. You just spend time with them until you get to know them, and then when you get to know them, you start to speak. But Americans or Anglos go to Alaska, and we feel the way you get to know someone is to speak. So one person thinks first you get to know each other, then you speak, and the other one thinks you get to know each other by speaking. You can see the misunderstanding. Athabascans think Anglos are hypocritical because they act like your friend when they're not. They pretend to be your friend by speaking to you, but they're not your friend because you don't know each other yet. And this is where we get the stereotype of the stony-faced Indian, the silent Indian that never speaks. And this is an important point, that many of these stereotypes that we have of other cultures, and women have of men and men have of women, come from the way we react to other people's styles because we don't understand the logic of the style. So when my colleagues went to Alaska to do their research, suddenly Susie, who was Chinese from Hawaii, was interrupting Athabascans all the time. And she was the conversational steamroller, talking all the time because they didn't say anything, because she didn't give them enough pause to speak. Well, lest you think it stops right there, I have one more piece of this story. I went for a conference to Alaska, and my friends sent me to a village in the Arctic Circle called Fort Yukon, and because they wanted to see how I would survive as a very talkative New Yorker, in fact, New York Jewish speaker, in a village where nobody speaks to somebody they don't know. I had lived in Greece, and I was used to going to a village, and everyone would pour out of their houses and talk to me and pull my hair and ask me, why does your brother let you travel alone? And we would have a conversation. And I liked that. I was comfortable with that. So sure enough, I went to this Athabascan village. I got off my little tiny plane that flew 4 people in, and I walked around the village, and everybody acted like nothing unusual happened, and nobody would speak to me. And I could stand this for about 2 hours, and then I did what I thought I would never do. I called the local missionary so I would have someone to speak to. So my friends thought this was amusing, and my friend Ron gave a test, a midterm exam to his students. They had read my books, so they knew that I characterized myself as a speaker a high involvement speaker who uses talk to get to know people. So he asked them, and fast-paced, and he asked them, Deborah Tannen went to Fort Yukon. What do you think was her experience there? And most of the students answered correctly. She would be very uncomfortable because people would not speak to her. But one student who lived in the very northernmost village in the Arctic Circle, and his comment was, people in Fort Yukon talk so fast she probably fit right in. So I like to tell this story because it captures something that is very important about conversational style that it's always the relative style that's important. It's never the absolute. And this is why, after I talk about some of the things I'll talk about tonight and things you may have read about that I've written, I can't give advice. I can't say this is the right way to speak, because something will work very well with one person, will work very badly with someone else. You have to always be aware of the response of the person you're speaking to. It's the interaction of the styles. So I use the idea of women and men growing up in different worlds, because this is a metaphor, and it is, of course, only a metaphor, to capture the ways that we have systematically different ways of using language, just as at the Baskins versus Americans have different ways, or the Midwest versus New York. Different ways of that seem to us automatic and self-evidently natural. One way that I talk about this is conversational rituals. We think that we say what we mean, but actually we have learned over time, this is the way you speak, and this is what you expect in response. So that's the sense in which it has a ritual nature. It's something prescribed that goes in this order. Women and men have learned as children different rituals, tend to learn. Not every woman and man learns it, but tend to learn these different rituals. Many of the rituals that are common among women will seem to take a one-down position in order to save face for the other person, but you depend on the other person to pull you back up. Many of the rituals that are common among men have a very different purpose. It may be a ritual argument, a playful fight. You'd use opposition in a ritual way. So some examples of this, because the result is the same. Conversational rituals are like balancing on a seesaw. You sit on your side, but you trust the other person to sit on their side. If the other person gets off, you go plopping to the floor, and you wonder, how did I get here? You wonder, did I do something wrong? But it may be that the other person did not do their side of the ritual. One example of how these rituals can be different, one, again, that I have become, I think perhaps maybe the one example that I have become the most associated with. I never thought of all the things I wrote about, and you just don't understand. This would be the one thing everybody wants to hear about the most. The question, why don't men like to stop and ask for directions when they're lost? And this came as a surprise to me, because my husband does stop and ask for directions, so that just goes to show that nothing is absolute. And I'm the one who says, no, I'm going to get the map and find it on the map. But it seems quite common that the woman will say, well, honey, let's just stop and ask this person, and he keeps driving, and says, no, I can find it. I think it's right around here. So, well, it's right around there somewhere. That the experience of stopping and asking directions seems to be quite different. Many women seem to feel if you stop and ask directions, you're saying you make a fleeting connection to a stranger, you haven't lost anything. And many men will seem to have the feeling if you stop and ask directions, you're putting yourself in a one-down position, saying, I'm lost and I need your help. Can you help me? And that one-down position is uncomfortable, so it makes sense to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes or however much time it takes to find your own way. But many men have said to me, well, this really isn't true. That's really not the reason. The reason I don't like to stop and ask directions is that the person I ask probably doesn't know either. So he's going to tell me the wrong thing. And I would rather be lost because of my ignorance than because of somebody else's ignorance. Also, they tell me you can learn a lot about the neighborhood by driving around. And I think that's true. I think there really is some truth to that. And I have been told wrong directions by people, so I know there is some truth to that also. But what interests me is, why is it more common for men to tell me, if someone doesn't know, they will tell me the wrong thing? And why don't women think of that? And I think it is this different sense of what a person will respond. Now, women seem to assume if someone doesn't know, they will say, I don't know. And men more likely to assume people don't like to say, I don't know. And so if you ask someone and he doesn't know, he will try to say something so as not to say, I don't know. So these in themselves are different conversational rituals. Many of the things that I talk about in private relationships in the first two books, in Talking from 9 to 5, I discuss how they can play out in the workplace. And here's an example about this one. A woman who is a physician wrote to me that when she was in her residency training, she had a negative evaluation, and she asked the supervising physician why, and he said, "You don't know as much as the others." She felt this was unfair. So she said, "Why do you say that? What led you to this conclusion?" And he said, "Well, you ask so many questions." And she felt that the others didn't know any more than she did, but when she didn't know, she asked. And when they didn't know, they didn't ask. There is research by a linguist, Kate Remlinger, that seems to support this in the university context. She noticed that women were asking more questions in class, and she interviewed male and female students. And indeed, the women said if they didn't know, more women said, "If I don't know, I would ask." And more of the men said, "If I don't know something, if I don't understand what the teacher's saying, first I would try to look it up. If that doesn't work, I would ask somebody in private. If that doesn't work, I would ask the teacher, but during office hours, not in class." Why these differences? It seems to be much more awareness on the part of more men than women, again, not all, more men than women, that if you ask, not only are you getting information, but you are also projecting an image of yourself as someone who doesn't know. And there are many situations where it is quite realistic to realize that you are projecting this and to be aware of it. Many women seem less aware of that, and so more likely to ask if they don't know. In the workplace, we all have to realize that not only are we doing work, but we are getting judged by other people. And so there are many situations where it might be effective to not ask. In fact, one woman that was interviewing me for this new book, when I told her this example, she said, "That woman was probably a pain in the neck asking questions all the time." She said, "I don't like when people ask me questions. I expect them to find out for themselves." And so people have very different opinions about whether they like to be asked questions or not. And it's good to be aware of the person you're working with. Another example, this is another example of how I really believe you cannot say it's better to ask or it's better not to ask. In some situations, surely it's better to ask. If you're a doctor and you have to make a decision about how much the dosage of medicine, I would say perhaps it's better to ask. Especially if you're the patient, you would hope that your doctor would ask rather than guessing. Although I am told by medical students that very often they do guess because they don't want to reveal what they don't know. But there may be other situations in which it is wise not to ask, and surely there's no one answer to the best thing. But the different focus for women and men is, to me, very interesting. Another conversational ritual that seems to be different, how frequently women are told, "Don't apologize, it's not your fault." Women seem to say, "I'm sorry," more often than men. For example, this occurred with a teacher. She had to send a difficult student to the principal. Then she met the principal in the hall, and he told her that he had suspended the student. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he said, "Well, it's not your fault." So she thought that was strange, and she did what many women do. She went home and she told the story over dinner. And her daughter said to her, "Well, gee, Mom, what a funny thing for him to say." And her husband and her son said, "Well, why did you apologize? It wasn't your fault." So they her husband and son seem more inclined to think that "I'm sorry" is an apology. Now, certainly in some situations, "I'm sorry" is an apology. But in this case, I believe she meant, "I'm sorry that happened. It's too bad that the student was suspended. That must have been difficult for you to have to suspend the student." So "I'm sorry" can mean "I'm sorry that happened." It doesn't always mean "I'm sorry, I apologize." And also, many women seem to say "I'm sorry," and it really doesn't mean anything. It's just a ritual, like tipping your hat. You bump into someone and you say "I'm sorry." Or they step on your foot and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry." And it's not because you apologize that they stepped on your foot. It's because something needs to be said. It's a human interaction, and you feel you need to acknowledge the other person, and "I'm sorry" is an automatic thing. But in work situations and in home situations too, because women seem more likely to use I'm sorry in this ritual way, men are more likely to think I'm sorry as an apology, and therefore to want to avoid it, because it puts you in that one-down position. I observed situations where I saw men who had really done something wrong and didn't say I'm sorry. There was one very funny one, to me very funny, I was observing, and a lawyer was talking on a speakerphone to people in another office, and the voice was coming out, but he didn't have the receiver in his hand. The speakerphone was on, and he knocked it with his elbow, and the phone got disconnected. So the secretary reconnected, and I was waiting for him to say what I would have said, which is, "Oh, I'm sorry, I knocked the phone with my elbow. Where were we?" And instead he said, "Hey, what happened? One minute you were there, and the next minute you're gone." And this was amazing to me. He didn't have to say I'm sorry. He didn't have to admit it was his fault. I suspect in this situation it was probably insignificant, but I also suspect that this lawyer had a habit to never admit it was his fault if he didn't have to. And I would guess in some situations this served him well, and in some situations it did not. I'm always a little bit frustrated and disappointed when I hear people who comment on my work and say, "Deborah Tannen says women apologize too much and they should stop." Because this is not what I think I'm saying. I feel that I'm saying it's true. Women tend to apologize or to say I'm sorry more often than men. They may indeed apologize more because they are less concerned that they will lose face or look in a one-down position if they apologize. But I don't necessarily think it's too much, and I don't necessarily think we should stop. In some cases, you might feel I'm the only one, and people are thinking that I apologize, and I don't mean it as an apology, so I'm going to stop. In other cases, you might educate the people you talk to. It's not an apology, so I'm going to keep saying it, and you should understand how I use it. But there also may be situations where men or other people, women who do not apologize, might do better to do it more. When I interviewed people about what frustrates them with the people they work with, I was frequently told, my boss, my peers, my subordinates are frustrating because they don't admit it when they make a mistake. And many people might find that if you make a mistake and someone is angry at you, and this can be in a private relationship as well as at work, if you simply say, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake," the anger dissipates. Whereas if you insist, "I didn't make a mistake, it was right of me and you were wrong," then the person gets more and more angry. So sometimes it can be quite disarming to apologize. So again, I feel it's not always good to do one or the other. You have to be aware of the effect of your style in the situation. But this is a ritual that's more common among women than men. Women seem to use it as a way to acknowledge connection with the other person. Interpreted through a lens of status, it can seem to be taking a one-down position. Here's another one. A woman who was a university president was talking to her secretary, and she said something like, "Could you do me a favor and type this?" And the secretary did it, and it was fine. But then it turned out that she was overheard by a member of the Board of Trustees, and he said later to her, "Now don't forget, you're the president." So he felt that by saying to her secretary something like, very polite, "Could you do me a favor and type this?" that she was talking in a way that showed she didn't have the confidence to really tell her secretary what to do. And this seems to be something that comes up quite often. She was using a ritual politeness. She knew that the secretary had to do what she told her to do. She wasn't really asking a favor, but she put it in this way to be, from her point of view, polite and respectful. And in fact, this secretary appreciated that. And there may be other people who don't. An example where it did not work, a woman who owned a bookstore had to have a talk with the manager because she felt she had told him to do something. He said he would do it, but then a couple days later it wasn't done. It turned out she had said to him something like, The bookkeeper needs help with the billing. How would you feel about helping her out? And he said, fine. By which he meant, fine, I'll think about how I would feel about helping the bookkeeper out. And he thought about it, and he decided he had more important things to do. She thought fine meant fine, I'll do it. And it turned out that he really took literally her question, how would you feel about it? And this is really quite typical. If you use something in a ritual way with someone who doesn't share the ritual, they interpret it literally. Just like going to a country where people have rituals, and maybe you may respond this way too. Many people have told me Americans are so insincere and hypocritical. They ask, how are you? And they don't want to hear how you are. Because it's a ritual. How are you? And the answer is fine, and it's just a greeting. You don't want a medical report. But for cultures that don't do that, you take it literally. You think you've been asked, and you think the person should listen to the answer. And the same thing can happen with giving directions in an indirect way. Another example is, let's see, what have I got here? Woman who had to tell a man to rewrite a report, so she had to give criticism. She started by telling him everything that was good about his report because she wanted to save face for him. Many of the rituals that are common among women are intended to save face for the other person. So she started with everything that was good. And then she told him what he had to change. And when he redid the report, he didn't change any of the important things. So she talked to him again and asked him why he didn't, and he said, but you told me it was fine. So because she started with everything that was good, he expected her to begin with the main point. So to him, the main point was everything is fine, and he switched off. And he thought what came later was optional. She was just saving face for him. I think there's a great tendency here, again, to accuse the other person. So she felt he's insubordinate, he doesn't do what I tell him to do. He can't take criticism. And he felt she changes her mind. First she told me it's fine, now she tells me it's not. Women change their minds all the time. And a lot of these stereotypes we have of women and men come from this. Many of the threads that run through the reactions that women get in the workplace is they lack confidence, because so many of the ways that they are talking will ritually put themselves in a one-down position. But if taken literally, they seem to lack confidence. One final example was a woman who went to a conference with a man, and after the conference they were going home. Both of them had given presentations, and she said to him on the way home, your talk was great. And he said, thank you. So she felt funny, like something was missing. So she said, well, what did you think of my talk? So he told her a critique, everything about her talk that he thought she could improve. And she felt very frustrated. It's the seesaw. She was plopping to the ground, thinking, I'm in a one-down position. He's giving me all this advice about how to improve my talk. And then she even felt worse about it because she thought, I asked for it. I asked him, what did he think? But I think really she didn't intend to ask for a critique. She was trying to get what she thought was the ritual response. That was a great talk. Your talk was great, thank you, your talk was great too. Because he didn't share the ritual, she tried to encourage him, and of course that gave him the opportunity to talk in a way that put her down. I truly don't know in this situation whether he sincerely misunderstood and sincerely thought, take her literally, she asked me what I think, so I'm going to tell her, or whether he simply took advantage of the opening that she gave him. But I don't think it matters. I think what matters is that she was used to a ritual that he didn't share, and the conclusion was that she looked less confident than she was. She looked like she was asking for advice. What are some rituals that are more common among men that women may take literally? The most common ones are using ritual opposition. In other words, if you look at little boys, they will often use fighting as a way to become friends. Two little boys are playing, a third boy wants to join them, he will pick a fight. And so then they rough and tumble, knock each other around, and pretty soon they're playing together. The little boy who likes the little girl And so he pulls her pigtails and gives her a shove. And instead of beginning the rough and tumble play with him, she goes running away in the other direction and thinks he attacked me. And he thinks, doesn't she want to play with me? Doesn't she like me? It's a very different way of using opposition. You see this in close relationships. I have heard complaints about women in relationships with men. We go out to dinner and I say something and he begins arguing with me. And she feels this is disloyal. He should be on my side. He should support me. He should not argue against me in public. We should be a team. He feels this is a sign of respect. We each have our own opinion and we argue, and that's a good thing to do. In the workplace, it's also common. One woman told me that she shared an office with a man and heard him arguing quite animatedly with another man, and then later they were joking, and she said, how can you pretend that fight never happened? And he said, we're not pretending it never happened, and it's over. It seems more common for women to assume that if you have an argument, you really must work it out and patch it up before you can move on to other business and be friends again. And more common for men to use opposition in a creative way. In fact, it's common at work to hear men insulting each other as a way to be friendly. Kind of playful banter, insulting each other. When men comment on each other's clothes, and I observe this and have this on tape, it's often an insult. What a terrible tie. That's the worst, ugliest tie I ever saw. Where did you get it? Whereas if women comment on each other's clothes, it's more likely to be a compliment. And neither one is meant. If someone gets a haircut and you don't think it's a good haircut, it's very unlikely for a woman to say that's a terrible haircut. You would have to say, oh, you had a hair, oh, how nice. Maybe later she might ask you, what do you really think? And then you would tell her. But if they don't ask you what you really think, you have to pay a compliment. One man told me that another friend of theirs told him he was so pleased he hadn't seen a third friend in years, and they just saw each other and they're still such good friends. And the evidence that they were such good friends is that the first thing he said to him was, hey, what'd you do to your hair? You look like shit. And to him, this was great. It shows we're still friends, we're still close, we insult each other in a playful way. So it's a very different ritual use of language. So the thread that runs through everything I've said, and obviously you can see I can go on forever, but I'd like to leave a chance for you to ask questions and to have a discussion with Yvonne. The thread that runs through everything that I do is that conversation is not invisible. It's not like packaging. Words are not like packaging. The meaning, the idea is important, and you wrap it up in words and send it to someone, and they take the meaning out. But rather, the words are inseparable from the meaning. And the way you say things is something that seems automatic, it seems natural and obvious, but people have very different conversational styles, very different assumptions about how you say what you mean. What I would hope would come out of this, I don't have easy solutions, this is the best way to do it, but it should be quite helpful to understand the process so that when you are not happy with the way an interaction is going, you can try doing something different, try questioning the other person about what they mean, try getting them to understand how you mean what you say. The most crucial thing, I believe, is the mutual respect, not to assume there is one right way. My way is right, your way is wrong. That, I believe, is the source of so much frustration and ill will and misevaluation between people. So in that sense, I hope that the mutual respect will be the foundation on which more constructive relationships can be built. Thank you.
That was a wonderful lecture.
You mean it, or you're just saying it?
No, I mean it. I wouldn't be here if I didn't mean it.
Thank you.
Now, this is the difficult part of the evening because now it's your turn to ask questions. We have some microphones here, but there's, I think, over 400 of us tonight. So if you have a question, you might just holler and shout it out in any language you can think of. And if need be, I'll translate. That's for the people who are shy to speak English in public. But the first question I can ask, Deborah, you said about all these peoples, the more up north you got, the more silent they were. What has the North Pole got to do with it?
Isn't this fascinating? There are many countries of the world where the stereotype is, actually it's the opposite. It's not always the north. Maybe it's away from the equator, actually, when you think about it.
Yes.
In many cultures of the world, the stereotype is that the northerners are more fast-talking and the southerners are more slow-talking. And Finland is an example, by the way, where this seems to be the case. The United States, very much that's the case. And what's really interesting is that whatever part of the country that people speak more quickly, they are stereotyped as too aggressive, too pushy.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever part of the world where people speak more slowly, they are stereotyped as stupid.
That's true.
Yeah,
But
it seems to be the reaction of the different style. So if you're talking and nobody ever says anything, you think they're stupid.
There's no research on temperature and
I
fast
don't
talking.
know. I really don't know.
'Cause that's something I should like to know.
I don't know. I don't know why it goes north-south. Or in Alaska, it seemed to be the farther north, the slower they spoke.
The funny thing is, Holland is so small, but we even find a difference between northerners and southerners.
And what is the difference?
Well, anyway, the southerners drink more, we say, and they talk more, and more slowly too, I think. People from Brabant, oh, they're so slow, aren't they, Mike? Who's got a question yet? Just raise your hand or holler or yes.
Or come to the microphone.
You can
if
come to the microphone if you can knock out a few people.
Ms. Tannen, I've almost finished your book, You Just Don't Understand, and I would like to ask, of all the people you've interviewed, I can imagine that men, for example, and women have come with solutions as to how both sexes could communicate better with each other. Could you share with us the most common solution that men come with and the most common solution that women come with?
The question is the most common solution?
For a man's conflict and a woman's conflict?
In communicating with each other.
In communication. You
The
solve
most common
every...
solution or the most common problem?
Let's start out with the problem.
That's a good one. Let's start out with the problem.
To hell with the solution.
Because what you bring up about solution in itself is a very big difference. You may know one of the scenarios that I discuss quite a bit is a situation where a woman might come home and want to talk about everything that happened during the day. And much of what she wants to talk about is problems, because we have a ritual that we call, I call it troubles talk. In other words, I tell about a problem, and then you say, oh, I had the same problem, or oh, that must have been terrible. And then I say, yeah, I know, and this is what I think about it. You say, yeah, this is what I did when I had my problem. And you feel connected. Again, it's a ritual where you kind of put yourself one down because you say, I have a problem, and that is potentially one down. But the other person puts themselves in the same position, so it's equal. Or maybe they bring you up and they say, oh, you handled that very well. No, I don't think I did handle it very well. So it's a balance. And often this ritual will backfire when the woman comes home and tries to do that with the man, and she says, I had this problem at work today. And he said, well, this is what you should do about it. You should tell your boss that you're not going to take that anymore, and stand up for yourself, and don't let them do that to you. And she feels frustrated for several reasons. One, first of all, she wants to talk about it. And if you give the solution, the conversation is over. And that may be part of his motivation. I mean, my father actually said this to me. Well, if I give her the solution, she stops talking, and that's good. Because he doesn't want to hear about problems. I think there's often a different...
Consider women as a different sort of man. So you said when a man talks, it's just to decide who is one up and who is one down. Do they, when you're married to an animal like that?
Well,
is that what he's doing? When you talk to him, he thinks she wants one up.
I think we both assume that our way of being human is simply being human. And so we expect other people to be the same way we are.
But do they
So yes, in
interpret?
answer to the second thing that you said, I think many things that come up between women and men, part of the frustration is that a man may feel a woman is trying to dominate him when she feels she's not. One good example that seems to come up a lot is she may feel that she asks him to do something, and he keeps putting it off. And she feels, if you love me, you would do it. And she doesn't understand. And he feels, you're trying to boss me around, that you asked me to do something, I should drop what I'm doing right away and run and do it for you. It's that assumption that the person who gives orders is the dominant one. This really came clear to me. I was on a talk show. Somebody called in and said, my wife and I get along very well because we both agree there can be only one boss in the house, and that's me.
So was that his solution to the problem?
The talk show host was a woman, and she answered. We'll get back. We're a little far afield, but I haven't forgotten your question. The talk show host became very frustrated, and she answered the question, and she went on at great length. Nobody should be boss. Everybody's equal. And she went on at great length explaining this. And then the next person called, and he said, that's what's wrong with you women. You want to dominate us. And the talk show host said, excuse me, I'm going to scream. And she did in the microphone. She went, ah!
Did it help any?
Well, it helped me because I understood for the first time, I think, what was going on. Because the first caller was very articulate. He said, there can be only one boss. And so she went on at length saying, women don't want to be subordinate. If you assume there can only be one boss, then if she doesn't want to be subordinate, she wants to be dominant. And I think the meaning of being told what to do is really quite different. But I don't think, in answer to what you said earlier, that men always are. Look, what you said, that they're the kind of animal that
They interpret what you say in their terms.
Well, we do the same
Yes.
thing, though.
Yes,
We interpret
but that's
everything men
different.
say in our terms.
Did you get an answer
So
to
I
your
think we
question?
both assume.
Well, I just was wondering if there was kind of a solution that a lot of men came up with. I can imagine that men are frustrated with communicating with women
yes.
sometimes.
Okay, right. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I say sorry, but that's okay.
Yeah, you did it all wrong.
No, I think it's good. It's good to say I'm sorry. I don't mind. I think people reading my book, it's more common for men to want the solution than to say, okay, I read your book, but now what's the solution? And more common for women to say, I loved your book because now I understand. But in terms of the solution they do come up with, I think it varies very much with the individual. So that problem of coming home at the end of the day, and she wants to talk, and he doesn't understand, why is she telling me all this? And why does she want to wallow in her problems? If she doesn't want to solve it, why does she want to talk about it? And I have been told by quite a few men that being told the solution, just listen to her. This doesn't help because you don't want to listen to something you think doesn't make any sense. It drives you crazy to listen to something that makes no sense. But once they understand why it's important to women to do this, then it becomes quite automatic to want to listen. And I think people have different solutions. One solution is maybe you come home and for 1 hour you leave him alone and you don't talk to him and he can unwind and watch television. And then for 1 hour he listens to you. Or another, just to end, my husband who's here tonight, so I'll use him as an example. Once said to me, I know you don't want to hear the solution, but it's too frustrating for me to sit here and listen to you go on and on when I know the solution. So let me tell you the solution. And then if you want to keep talking about your problem, you can. And I think that is just as good a compromise as saying he has to just listen to the problem. So I think you find your own way of compromising once you understand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Somebody else? Yes, go right ahead. You want? Yeah? I'll repeat. Forward. Did the problem get worse since feminism took us over?
I see change. I don't attribute change to feminism. I see feminism as a reaction to change. I think women are now in workplaces where women were not before. this creates new problems for men who have to deal with women when they didn't have to before.
Was it easier
For women,
before?
I think in a sense, well, what do you mean by easy? I think maybe people were frustrated and that was not easy for them. There were women perhaps who were home who were not happy being home, and so that was not easy. But in the sense of change is always difficult. So to have to I think historically women and men moved much more in separate worlds. I think it's fairly unusual, if you look at cultures of the world, fairly unusual for women and men to try to be best friends, to communicate together in their private life, in their work life, to socialize together, to do jobs together. It's fairly new.
There's more women working nowadays in outside jobs. Did that make the problem of communication worse in any way?
In the past, women did work, but they worked in very different jobs. If they worked in the same office, they were not in the same role. The men were the bosses, the women were the secretaries. So it was more prescribed. Now things are much more confused, and I think the workplace is especially confusing to everybody because many of the ritual ways that we have learned to relate to each other from people of the other sex is based on courting relationships, chivalry, where many men have learned they should take care of women, they should be protective of them. And now we're saying, don't be protective, and nothing you do is right. You can be criticized if you hold a door open. You can be criticized if you don't hold a door open. And I think this is quite difficult for men to know what's the right thing to do, as it's difficult for women to know what to expect.
What would you like to ask? Does everybody understand? Can everybody hear this? No, they can't. This lady said, oh, she goes to the microphone. Good.
So they tend to only tell you what wasn't right, and they don't tell you first what was. It makes me feel like nothing I wrote so far was any good at all. And that's not what they mean. And they wonder why I think that way. Because what they don't criticize, they have accepted. Isn't that?
You're putting your finger on something very common that I observed and found very much in my research at work. And research of others shows this too. Women praise more, and they expect praise more. And so if you don't get praise, many women feel something's wrong. There seems to be more of an assumption among men. If my boss says nothing, then everything's fine. Whereas the women will feel if my boss says nothing, there may be a problem he's not telling me about. And quite a few men told me they had women working for them for the first time, and they were very puzzled. They suddenly got a lot of complaints. Why don't you like my work? If there's a problem, just tell me. I'd rather know, right before you fire me. And him feeling completely confused because I'm treating the woman the same way I always treated men, and there's a problem, and I never had a problem.
Yeah, that's
before.
the same thing.
It's the difficulty of if people are not the same and you treat them the same, that creates problems.
Same
but the issue of
applies
praise is
to
a very
love.
crucial
But
one.
how does it come about that they are not the same? Is it only because boys tease each other anyway, and girls are used to giving each other compliments? Is that
Again,
why?
I think because the ritual giving of compliments is something that girls have done from very early, and have learned to do and learned to expect. And boys don't tend to compliment and praise each other. Rather, they will play insult.
But
each
they
other.
don't take those insults personally, as girls might do, or what?
Right. Well, of course,
Oh.
it can go over the line, and then they do. But the tendency is not to. This is an example of people ask me, "Am I telling women to talk like men, or am I telling men to talk like women?" And I always say, well, neither and both. I think we all can benefit by being more flexible. But giving praise, and I talk about this in the book, giving praise is something that everyone seems to appreciate. So managers who learn to give praise seems to be appreciated by men as well as women who work for them. So I think this is something that everybody could benefit from. But it's very crucial to realize that we have these different rituals so that the boss who has a woman working with him for the first time doesn't think she has a problem. She's insecure. Why does she need so much reassurance? The other guys don't. So
Yes, because
that's the real danger.
This is criticism and praise about what one does, isn't it? But the other thing is criticism and praise about the way one speaks. And I feel they also criticize you for instance, being too emotional and all that.
Like, don't apologize.
Well,
it's criticism, don't apologize.
But by criticizing you, they define what is the right way to talk at work, don't they? So if you accept that criticism and you start doubting you're not normal or whatever,
Yes.
then this is what remains the norm, isn't it?
Yes, and this is something you can imagine I discuss in great detail in the new book, Words at Work, because, and I make this point, that in my other books, I always am very clear that women's styles, men's styles are both equally valid. But the work situation is different because you come into a world where a certain norm is already established, and the norms for the work world are closer to styles more common among men. So women are the ones who come in, as well as people of ethnic differences also, come into a world where the norm is set and it's different from yours. So you're the one who's always told you're not speaking the right way, you're not doing it right. Like the university president who was told by the board of trustees, don't forget, you're the president, implying you don't speak the right way to your subordinates. And this was very common that I observed, where a woman manager might have an excellent relationship with the women who work for her, but will be criticized by her boss for the way she talks to her subordinates. You don't keep control. You don't have the proper demeanor with the people you work with. And this is a constant problem for women. I have a chapter called Marked. It's kind of a complicated, well, it's not so complicated, but I don't have time to go to detail, but the idea is that many women in a workplace feel like an alien in a strange world because their ways of doing things suddenly are being criticized. And this is the kind of thing that I hope if enough people read my book, they will stop criticizing, and that the answer will not necessarily always be for women to change, but hopefully for managers to learn to appreciate the different styles of different people so that they can better judge people's true talents and take advantage of the talents of more people who work for them. You don't want a workplace where only one style can be appreciated and anyone whose style is different ends up leaving because they feel so frustrated.
Any questions? Oh, lots of them. There.
1, 2, 3.
Okay. Pardon?
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, we'll repeat it. Try again. Are the difference innate or are they learned? And would it change anything if little children would be brought up together, boys and girls together? Would they learn anything?
Yeah. There seems to, I would be surprised if it was not some combination of biological and cultural, but the specific rituals I discuss are cultural because it's different in different cultures. And for that reason, I discuss in the new book quite a bit about Japanese style because it's a very good antidote to our assumption that boys must be this way and girls must be that way. Many of the styles I describe as more typical among women in the Western context are typical for women and men in Japanese and other Asian cultures. Avoidance of confrontation, use of indirectness to get someone to do things. So I think it definitely is a very large cultural component. There is somewhat of a biological component, seems to be in the tendency of boys to be more aggressive and to use fighting more. But that doesn't mean that it is nurtured in every culture.
What about the old testosterone?
Yeah, so that's the theory. But what's interesting is that cultures can control testosterone if they wish. A very interesting study by an anthropologist of 6-year-old boys all over the world, many different cultures, and she found that in every culture, if 6-year-old boys are left alone, they fight with each other. But in some cultures, 6-year-old boys were not left alone. So the culture can exercise a great pressure on
So
the
what
children.
happens? They start
So
talking?
they don't fight as much. So I think there is some combination of biological and cultural, but the specific things seem to be fairly cultural. Would it change if boys and girls played together? That I don't know, because there doesn't seem to be any experiment where they really do, because when they're given the choice, they choose.
They kill each other.
But
girls
that's
kill the
natural
boy.
then. That's innate then, I think, or not? I mean, if they
Pardon?
choose to play with each other, with the same sex and not with each other, that seems to be.
Well,
Well,
it's
you know,
innate
it's a
to
very-
play with each
yeah,
other.
Some evidence to support what you're saying. It's not research, it's anecdotal, but many people have told me after I give a lecture, I grew up the only sister with 6 brothers, and I ended up playing like the boys. And when I went out to play with the girls didn't like me, but it serves me very well at work. And I have been, and I have been told by men who come up to me or stand up after a lecture and say, I was the only brother, and I had all sisters, and I learned to talk like the girls, and when I went out to play with the boys, they creamed me. You know, the boys gave me a terrible time. And one man actually called me, it was an African-American man in a talk show, and he said, and now I have a son, and it's very difficult for me to relate to my son because I am more used to talking to girls. So this is evidence that, yes, if you do have extended communication with children of the other sex, you could adapt.
You have another customer over there.
Yeah.
Go
hi.
ahead.
Thanks. I'd like to follow up on this. I don't have trouble communicating with men because they're.
Could you
adults.
use the microphone for
I thought-
talking
I'm
into?
sure. Here we go. Okay. Yeah. Fine. I find the question of little boys and little girls very interesting. I'm the mother of 2 children, and they're both boys, and I grew up in a family of mostly girls. So sometimes I find it hard to figure out what they're up to. And I was wondering, I noticed that most of the adults they deal with are women. And do you think that the fact that little boys, their teachers and their caretakers are mainly female, and when they're small, there seems to be a disproportionate number of them who have to visit principals, who end up in special education classes and in Ritalin. Is there any chance that some of that has to do with the fact that the female teachers just aren't clued in on behavior that is within the norm for them?
Did you understand?
Yeah.
Could
should
you
we
repeat
the
it, please?
question for the-
I couldn't
It
follow.
seems to be, the question seems to be about the fact that boys have female caretakers and female teachers, and is that why they have so many problems being sent to the principal, being disciplined? Because is that because they're yes, I think this is very much the case that little boys are often judged by norms that are more comfortable for little girls. Parents and teachers expect them to sit still and talk nicely to each other, which is much more comfortable and easier more for girls than boys. Not all girls, and little girls who don't want to sit still have the same problem. But it is more common for the girls. And I do discuss this a little bit, and you just didn't understand. A transcript that I present was a kindergarten teacher talking to her class, and I got it from a paper written by a researcher that had nothing to do with this, but when I read it, it just jumped out at me that the teacher was complimenting all the girls for being good and criticizing all the boys for not sitting still.
For that's the
So-
way you work.
Oh,
You
look
make
at Susie.
transcriptions
Yeah.
of tapes that are recorded in actual conversations that take place all in normal everyday life. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. And it seems that in school it is more difficult for boys because they're being expected to sit still inside and talk. Something that is easier for the girls than for the boys, and that's why boys have a lot of discipline problems in school.
Another question. Go ahead. There's somebody who...
Somebody in the second
yes,
row
yes,
wants to speak.
yes.
And it's a man, so we should give him a chance.
Oh, ja. I'll get... Even wachten. Eerste meisje. Ik zit tegen het licht in te kijken.
There's
dat is
a
mooi.
group here also of American women married to Dutch men. And since American women that are
We
married to
missed that.
Dutch men, and since I've lived here now for 3 years, my boss is a Dutch man, and I'm married to a Dutch man.
She has this hobby in Dutch.
I have this Dutch hobby thing, yeah. But it's very interesting. You've brought up a lot of situations this evening, and I would like, Yvonne, also your opinion on this. There are several times in the workplace where I say to my boss, you don't give enough compliments. You immediately go to the criticism, and or I'll say to my husband, you're so blunt and you're so direct, and they don't ever say to me, God, you're so female, they say to me, you're so American. So I'm very curious. Now that I'm having this whole communication enlightenment here this evening, I would also like to know from your viewpoint, Yvonne, what Dr. Tannen has said this evening, is that true for you as a Dutch woman? I mean, are these also Dutch male-female things?
Yes.
Okay.
It is, and if I wouldn't like the things she said, I'd say, well, that only applies to Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's true. That's true. And it's interesting because in speaking with my sister on the phone, we start with, if we're having an argument, we start with, how are you? And I'm fine, and this is good. When he and his sister are having an argument, they're very direct with each other, and they say that that's Dutch, and I'm an American. But I think that what I found tonight is I think that what my boss would have said is you're being female.
Yeah, but we have a lot of those things. You come from the city, you're not born in Amsterdam, that's why you're a peasant, we have so
Right.
many differences.
Right.
I think this is really so crucial about human nature, that we look at each other through filters and labels. And in this here, the fact that you're American stands out as the most noticeable difference. So they think of that first.
Rather than you're a female.
Right, and if you're in the same culture, then you get whatever difference is most prominent. Oh, you women, oh, you men. Or you do that because you're Jewish, or you do that because you're African American, or you do that because you're from New York, or you're from California.
Yeah.
When
So
I was
absolutely, people put the label that is most prominent.
When I was a psychologist, my friend would say, you psychologist, then I changed to journalism, and he just went on and he said,
Right.
you journalist.
Or a lawyer, or accountant, or whatever, yeah.
By the way, I once heard a man who said, women... Wait. Ja, je komt dat doen. Kipper. Wacht even. And
This poor man has been trying to get the microphone
yes, he'll
all
get
evening.
there. They say that men never say, I love you. And this man commented on this and said, I love you and I'll phone you when it changes. There you go.
I have to remember that one.
Ga maar staan, schat, en doe het.
Knielde voor je, wat wil je
Daar
nog
hou
meer?
ik van, dat weet je.
The American lady that just spoke, was about the question I'd like to ask. Language is a cultural phenomenon. And we've lived in many countries, and I think the language has been very difficult, not only the language itself, but also the way people talk. Now, I have heard during your lecture and also during the questions that you've been studying that probably worldwide. I'm not sure about that. How
Yes, I
local is your theory about language between men and women, or is it mainly focused on the Western Hemisphere and probably the United States? I'd like to know if it's universal or it's local.
Yes. Of course, my own research began with cross-cultural communication, not gender. So my whole framework was developed in the relation to cross-cultural communication across different countries and also across Americans of different cultural backgrounds, either ethnic or part of the country or class, other backgrounds. So when I turned to the issue of women and men, I had no assumption that this would be the same in other countries. I assumed that what I was saying was true mostly for Americans. I've been amazed that the reaction I get from other countries is that this rings true. You Just Don't Understand has been published now in 18 languages. And I talk to people, as many as I can from these other countries, and say, how can this be true? Especially, for example, Korean, Japanese, Chinese. And I say to them, how can this be true? Especially because I know that Japanese, Chinese communication styles are so different from American. And they say, yes, it rings true. It seems that each culture is on a continuum, and so the range will be quite different. But the kinds of things that come up seem to be fairly similar. So that's quite amazing to me, too.
That's a question.
Well, first I'd like to add a comment to the other American lady who was
Wait, could you
talking
speak
before.
up a little bit because
Can
we
you-
have all
yeah?
these birds in the...
Okay.
On the roof.
I'm American too. I've been living in Holland for 20 years, and I felt right at home when I got here because I was always getting in trouble in school in America because I was considered aggressive and loudmouth, and I guess that was because I was put in charge of my siblings because I was the oldest. So being in a culture where people are direct, I felt right at home, and that's one of the things I still love about Holland, is that there's no BSing around. The Dutch don't like the way you're dressed, they tell you. But my question is something totally different. I don't know if you address it in your book From 9 to 5, because I haven't read that yet, but since you're a linguist, how do you feel about what is known in America as politically correct terminology? Because I've watched from afar with distress at how the language has changed to not insult women or accommodate feminism or whatever they want to call it. A chairman is no longer a chairman, it's a chairperson, a policeman, or whatever. They've got these sort of non-gender names for words that have been in our language for centuries. And then how do men feel about losing the word chairman? You know, how is, as a linguist, how does that work?
That's your question. How do you feel about the gender going out of certain words?
Yeah.
Or political correctness.
Yeah.
Do people here use that phrase, political correctness?
Yes, we do.
Okay. My feeling is that language does not have value in itself, but we put great value on it because of what it means socially. So people who feel strongly that you shouldn't say chairman because it refers to man. It's really, this isn't a linguistic thing. What is the word "man"? You don't say man. But it's the idea that the M-A-N ending chairman is man, and therefore it brings along everything you know about the culture. So it's a social phenomenon. Languages in which you don't have to make a choice between him or her or he or she in the verb are not necessarily less sexist cultures. It's arbitrary, but we think that it represents something about the culture. So I feel that because it has meaning for people culturally, it can make sense to say, I'm not going to say chairman because some people are going to be offended by that. I don't want women to be offended. So I'm going to say chair, and by that show that I'm a person who wants to include women. I don't think it's a logical argument. I think it's a emotional argument. I can also see the argument, well, why bother about language? There are so many more important things to think about. Let's fight about whether we have equal pay. Let's fight about domestic, make sure that women are represented in court with domestic violence, child care, and I'm sympathetic to that too. But I can see that it's something that means something to people, and so the point would be, in deference to the people who care about it, you try to honor that. But everything, of course, can be carried to an extreme.
I have a very sad...
Oh, sorry. There's just a part of that question that I didn't get an answer to, and that is well, business has always been male-dominated until recently, like the last 20 years. And men still, in some instances, try to control or maintain their power platform. So how do they feel about the change in language in this regard?
Yeah, I think again, the linguistic issue simply represents larger social forces. So people who feel resentful of the demands that are being made by women, for example, may also resent the demands to change their language and to say, it's too difficult, I can't change my language. Of course, we know it's easy for people to change language if they want to, but if you don't want to, it can seem like a big burden. So I think the language simply becomes the reflection of the social forces.
The sad thing is that we have to stop.
Can I just ask a last question over here?
Yes,
to your left.
Where are you?
Down here to your left.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And maybe there's another very, very last question, and that's it. Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, then I'll squeeze in two. Have you found in your husband a best friend?
What do you... Have you found in your husband what?
A best friend.
A best friend. Now,
I-
this is
this
a
is-
very intimate question.
Have I found in my husband a best
And
friend?
then please allow me my
And she
second
starts
one,
giggling. Is that an answer?
He's here. What can I say?
Yes.
He giggles too.
I say, actually, I'd mentioned him at the beginning of You Just Don't Understand, and I say there that that the man I married to is my best friend, and yet we also have these differences, and that's why I sought to understand them.
Does he have any clones?
Now, who's
No.
going to die if he or she doesn't get a chance to?
Well, the last bit is, do you have any plans for future books? What are your plans,
Plans
now?
for future books? Are you working or doing nothing?
Oh, plans for future books. At the moment, I'm planning to write the next book about my father and his childhood, my memories of my childhood with him, a more personal book.
Now, somebody was dying there in the middle.
I'm here
Oh,
already.
here.
Well, my question is, we're talking about a problem, but is it really a problem we're dealing with? I wonder.
Hell no. Maybe if it's no problem, we don't have to solve it.
When we try to solve this problem of miscommunication between men and women, shouldn't we get a world that is very boring to live in?
What's the question?
This man thinks the world would be a boring place to live in if we didn't fight about words.
Well, that
You want
does
to fight?
make me think about what I said earlier about men are more likely than women to use fighting as a positive way to get close. So I think if you feel that fighting gets close, then it has a good purpose. But yeah, I mean, in one sense, I agree with you. I don't think we're ever all going to be the same. It's a problem if it leads to frustration, and it seems to lead to frustration. But if we could come to accept the differences and lose the frustration, then I think it would be less of a problem.
The people who are up there, do they have questions at all? Because there's no way for you to get to the microphone. They have a microphone? No? No questions? Okay.
People need to go home.
Deborah Tannen, this was a wonderful evening. You're going to stay here and sign books for us. And
I think Anne is.
Anne wants to say something. Anne, talk.
I would like to thank Deborah Tannen and Yvonne Kronenberg and you, the audience, for making this evening such a lively event. I'd like to give you a chance to go home or buy books or have your book signed, and that will take time, so we need that time. I'd like to pay the attention to the new season. We expect Abraham Pais and Simon Schama and Francis Fukuyama. So if you wish information, you can leave it in the hall on the list. And I thank you for coming here, and thank you again, and see you in the new season.